Does this look and sound good?
Yeah, man, you sound great. You
Awesome.
sound great.
Great.
I always love it when people show up with earbuds in because that makes it a lot easier when for talking over.
For sure. Yeah. No. Versus there's nothing worse than a podcast with two people talking at the same time.
That's a lot of my work in the editing process is try to trim those out or clean those up. But yeah, sometimes it's not so bad. So how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. I just got inside, just was doing morning chores, shot a video, ready to roll, ready to chat.
Yeah, I well, these early morning ones, it doesn't leave me quite enough time to get out to the ranch to get my chores done yet. So um before we get rolling, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, like your name, where you're at, and we can kind of roll into it from there.
Sure. So my name's Morgan Gold. I run a farm here in northern Vermont called Goldshaw Farm. I've been doing it now for about 4.5 years. On our farm, we raise ducks, geese, chickens, and cattle. And I'm very much a beginning farmer. I have no agricultural background. I grew up in the suburbs. I spent like 20 years just kind of living in major northeastern cities and kind of had a midlife crisis in my like early mid 30s where I just kind of got fed up and said, hey, look, I want to go move to the middle of nowhere and start a farm. And so that's what I've been doing the last couple of years. And it's been
We got
pretty
to
great.
unpack that a little bit more.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so you're from that area. What like and you didn't grow up on a farm. So what's your education like and what you do for work for those few years and what led to the epiphany?
Yeah, sure. So I, grew up, really like an artistic kid. Like I went to art school for college. And when I got out of school, I was actually working just like at like doing marketing, and then eventually started to work at an investment company and an insurance company, and so most of my professional career was basically working in investments and insurance and other financial products. I kind of fell into it really by accident. I think the one trait I've always had that if you connect it from everything I've ever done is I'm a pretty good storyteller. And so whether it's me talking about, life insurance or talking about my farm, I'm able to do it in a way that I think is interesting for folks. And so that's how I kind of got to doing what I'm doing now. But from a education standpoint, I had no background here. It really wasn't until like my early 30s when my wife and I were living in New York City, and she would go out to the Union Square Farmers Market, and she'd come home and bring home groceries every Saturday morning, and she'd spend an insane amount of money. And it would be great stuff. It would be like, organic produce, grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb. And I'd be like, you're getting ripped off here. We're getting ripped off here. Like, they're just, making you pay more money than it's actually worth versus if I just went to, the key market and bought some regular old meat. It's all the same thing once you cook it. And she
Uh,
she kind of go ahead, yeah.
Key market is kind of like your supermarket,
Yeah, just a
normal grocery
supermarket.
store.
Yeah, Key Foods is just a New York City supermarket. But anyway, and so basically she challenged me to kind of do some more research. And so I did. And I started to read and I started to read more. And I started to go down, call it the regenerative agriculture sort of spiral, ultimately getting down into, folks like Mark Shepard and kind of getting even deeper than that. And from there I started to say, oh, this is interesting, and started an experiment where I started growing tomatoes on the rooftop of our apartment in Brooklyn, and did that for a little while. And then when we moved to Washington D.C. for work, I basically ripped up my front yard and put in garden beds. And I was like, I want to keep getting bigger here. I want to keep going further and further. And so that's what ultimately got us on this path of looking for our farm and finding it and saying, hey, let's move back to New England and doing kind of what we're doing today.
How nuts did your neighbors think you were when you ripped out your grass in DC and started growing things to eat?
Oh, completely insane. Because I mean, just to set the picture for folks, right? So picture Capitol Hill. So not just like, the Washington D.C. area where people like from like, Bethesda or Arlington say, hey, I live in D.C., but like Washington D.C. proper in Capitol Hill, in the southeast part of Capitol Hill, where it's just nothing but row houses, and we have this little postage stamp lawn. That first weekend when I started ripping up flower beds and just putting in, raised beds, my neighbors were all like, what's going on here? And they really did think I was crazy for that first year until kind of, I don't know, maybe midsummer when I started to have lots of stuff and started giving them food that we were growing, and like people saw like kind of how productive the front yard was becoming, that was sort of the first shift for them. But they definitely thought I was crazy those first couple months.
I, that's awesome. I was just sitting here thinking like the tyranny of lawns. Like what is the tyranny of lawns and lawn care done in this country? I posted a meme the other day on social media. This will be a couple weeks ago after the podcast comes out about there's a little kid and his dad. And his dad is like watering the grass and he's saying, you know, oh, we're growing all this wonderful grass. And the kid's like, Dad, why are we growing something we can't eat? Like
completely. I mean, the idea, unless you have herbivores grazing your lawn, it's insane to have something that you maintain, you water, and then you have to mechanically mow. And so it's like you're just creating one big time suck and you're not getting out of it. Versus if I look at the work that I was putting into my garden beds, it probably wasn't that much different, but we weren't buying produce like 6 months out of the year. And that makes a big difference.
I've had a thought for a long time, like lawns in town were kind of invented to give urban folks the illusion of land ownership and land stewardship.
I think that's very true. I think, you know, think about it, right? The call it post World War II vision of the white picket fence in the house, and every family has their own castle, and that's what it is. You know, yeah, you need that little play space to make you feel like, oh, I'm maintaining the grounds, when it's, yeah, you're, you know, running a cub cadet over, you know, 200 square feet, big deal.
Then you get into some of those like subdivisions and housing, you know, HOAs where it just becomes a contest of who can have the prettiest, greenest, most manicured, perfect looking lawn. And there's just lines of chemical trucks lined up every morning at 5 o'clock to go, you know, paint everybody's lawns green.
Oh, it is the worst. 100% agreed.
Okay, so back to Morgan. We're in Washington D.C. ripping up our lawn to grow tomatoes. Then
Yep.
what happened?
Well, so the next thing I really got into was tree crops, where you know, I'm personally a huge believer in the power of, call it, the savanna-based ecosystem, where you have, you know, kind of large trees that are often nut bearing at the centerpiece mixed with grasslands. And that got me into thinking about, well, how do I grow my own trees, and wanting to have a space to grow trees. And so that's essentially what pushed me to ultimately explore getting some land, you know, first and foremost, to grow trees. And you know, it was actually the first 12 months that we bought our farm, we were still in DC, we were working on fixing up the house. And in order to make kind of use of the land, I was focused on sprouting trees and planting bare root trees. And you know, we put in about, I don't know, 600 at the time. We have about 700 now. And a lot of those were planted, yeah, back in like 2017, where now I'm able to look at them and they're, you know, 12, 14 feet high. And I'm so glad that that was the first thing I started with, because I'm just a huge believer in the power of trees.
So it, and I agree with you that, you know, like grasslands, savannas, that's probably what a lot more of the country should look like. Probably not necessarily where I am. I'm west of 35. I'm west of the 100th meridian, and it just, you know, this is supposed to be grassland and prairie, but east of there, I agree with you 100% that, you know, we should be looking at a lot more open grasslands and savannas with some big nut bearing trees, or trees that provide forage or shelter for an animal. And I'm kind of thinking like, you know, the Bradford pears and the elms that, you know, everybody went nuts planting in the last 100 years. Yeah, those elms are kind of nice to look at, and they spread everywhere and they grow really easy, but they don't provide a whole lot. They provide a lot of pollen to make everybody's allergies go nuts. And, you know, same thing with the Bradford pear. The Bradford pear is not an issue where I'm at. It's, you know, mostly a thing farther east. And I understand that, you know, it's a pretty terrible plant too.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, the reality is, I think there's two things that you said there that are important to unpack. Number one, it's recognizing that the geography is going to dictate what's your appropriate ecosystem. And I find oftentimes in the farming and ranching space, especially on the internet lately, everybody is looking at their specific context and saying, my context is just how the world should be. And so people should be doing it the way that it works here in, you know, Montana or Missouri or Vermont, and like recognize like that's not exactly the case. Where, you know, traditionally here in Northern Vermont, right, when agriculture kind of reared its head in the late 1700s, you're talking about small sheep farms and small homesteads. And then, by the mid 1800s, you have essentially the emergence of dairy and small little hill farm dairies. Like, that's the context that rooted for my land. And so, kind of getting back to something that is multi-use, that is, kind of relatively leveraging a lot of different things in a single space. So I'm growing trees and raising poultry and doing cattle all in that same couple of acres. Like, that's what works here. That does not work in your ecosystem, to your point. Like, and it's just recognizing that there is that distinction, and so you need to manage your land differently accordingly.
Yeah, well, it's they added that as one of the now 6 soil health principles is you have to know your context. And even if, well, let's just say, even if your fence line neighbor is going to have a different management context due to his land base than you are, and it's going to drive him to make different management decisions, whether, he's feeding twice the amount, he's feeding hay for twice the days you are, or a third the days you are, or he has a completely different species mix on his land. It's going to be different for all of us. And, social media is hard. You're great at it. Don't get me wrong. You're great at it. I haven't even checked out your YouTube channel, but I see your platinum YouTube plaque in the back. What's that for? Is that for 1 million subs?
No, I'm not 1 million. I think I'm just about to hit 700,000. I think they send it to you for 100, I think is where that comes from. Yeah.
I have I don't think I have 4,000 on YouTube. So, but I don't put a lot of time into YouTube either. But I forget what I was going to say. Social media, it just gives us a very, very narrow window into somebody else's life. And I think folks think that they can take and draw a lot of conclusions from, a 1 minute or a 3 minute TikTok, or, a 12-minute YouTube video. And that it's so hard to tell a story in such a limited amount of time about a very, very complex subject that there's a lot of misinformation about.
Oh yeah, no. To do something right in 3 minutes or less, you have to edit your details out. Like, there's no way around it. And that oversimplification can let you hit a lot of people and reach a lot of people with an important message. But it can also leave other people saying, "But wait a minute, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that?" And leave them feeling like, this is all sus. And so it is the challenge in terms of how do you give enough information to make it interesting, compelling, and shape how people see the world. Because I think there's an important role that regenerative agriculture needs to use social media for, to help shift how consumers and their purchasing habits behave, and to ultimately get to a better way to produce food products. So I firmly believe that sometimes means oversimplifying things. That sometimes means keeping it, kind of focused on one very narrow avenue when there's a lot of other things that need to happen at once. And it's unfortunate, but it's also the reality.
Sometimes it's easier for me to keep making videos when I don't have something, blow up or go viral, because the negative comments or the challenging comments, maybe not necessarily challenging comments, sometimes the folks that don't understand quite a bit, they ask a question that's pretty off base, and it's like, there's no way I can even unpack that in 3 minutes.
Oh, completely. Well, but here's the thing, and I stopped doing this a while back, and it was amazing for my mental health, in that I have completely given up trying to change what other people think. And I've decided to put all of my energy into sharing my view of the world and how I think. And if people want to get on the bus and come along, awesome, great. I love to have you. But if they're gonna, continue to throw stones and say, "Oh no, this guy is, talking out his butthole," like, so be it. That does not bother me. That does not impact my view of myself. If I did let that view of that others have of me do that, I would be just kind of huddled underneath this desk, like crying in a fetal position on a regular basis. I just can't do it. I feel like at this point, and you just waste so much energy doing it too.
Yeah, I just don't have the mental energy to do that anymore. So I'm just going to choose not to. One thing I want to know. So you said you bought the farm in northern Vermont and you lived in DC for a year.
I lived in DC for 4 years, but yeah.
Well, for a year while you had the farm, you're
Yes,
commuting back and forth. What was that commute like? I'm just curious.
Oh, it was 539 miles of craziness. It kind of sucked because I would only get up to the farm, for like maybe a week at a clip once a month. Was kind of how I was doing it. I was trying to like work remotely, but I still had a job down in DC. I had the house that we were fixing up here. We had, some stuff we were doing ourselves. We had a contractor doing some stuff. My wife actually moved up here even before I did. So she moved up here in the fall of summer of 2017. I didn't move up here full time until the spring of 2018. And it was just simply, by virtue of the fact that I had such a belief and conviction that I wanted to start this farm and knew that I had to get up here. But what I did was basically look for a job up here because it was like I could afford to like just start farming. And
Right.
we can talk about this of like how to start a farm, but like starting a farm with zero knowledge and experience and just a piece of land is the easiest way to not be running a farm 2 years from then. And so I knew I wanted to have a day job to be essentially my training wheels to keep me going and help me learn while I try to get customers set up and a business stood up and build a brand and do all of these things you need to have a thriving business. And so, basically I was looking for a job up here while still working down there and, having my life in like 3 different places. And I mean, it kind of sucked looking back on it now. It's totally worth it. But yeah, that was like a really crap 18 months.
So let's just dive right into that. How to start a farm with no knowledge and no capital and no experience.
Yeah, so I mean, here's the thing. I think when people talk about starting a farm, I feel like they often go to production as the first thing that you need to think about in starting a farm. I need to know how to raise this thing, or I need to have this type of equipment to plant this type of thing. Like they're very focused on the tactical activities required to start producing.
Yes.
When I would actually argue that thinking about your target customers and thinking about their needs and creating an engagement with them and building a brand is arguably more important than the production side of it. I mean, you obviously can't have one without the other, but I think so often people focus on the production one because that's the I'll call it satisfying. That's the one that your image of, well, what's a farmer? It's that versus somebody who's a marketer. And, particularly if you're looking to do direct sale retail, which is, essentially what we do, right?
Right.
You need to be thinking about what's your brand. You need to think about your distribution strategy. You need to be thinking about your customers. And so what happened is when I moved up here full time in the spring of 2018, I knew I wanted to start with one product, which would help me learn how to raise some animals, learn if I like these animals or not, learn if it's all there, and figure out if I can even get a viable business model going. And so I went with ducks and I went with duck eggs because, yeah, well, number one, nobody was doing duck eggs around here. Everybody around here had backyard chickens.
Okay.
Number two, I knew it was a product I could probably produce a premium for. And so it was like those 2 factors said, let me start here. And then 3, the cost and barrier to entry was small. That first year to raise 40 ducks, I'm talking about, I don't know, $1,800 in sunk cost. So if I do it for a year and hate it and walk away, big deal. It's no skin off my nose. Versus if I look at what I sunk to get into cattle last year and get my herd started.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah, I'm talking 6 or 7 times that. And so like that reality is if you're going to be a beginner, and this is why I see people bag on, homesteaders and beginning farmers who start with poultry saying, that's not real farming. When I think that that's probably the best possible avenue other than market gardening you can go into because it's got quick cash flow turnaround. You have a real quick, success or failure read on how you're doing it. And your barrier to entry is so low. And so I started with those ducks and my thinking was at the time, gosh, I need to have customers who want to buy these duck eggs. Let me start making videos of me learning how to start this farm so that, 6 months from now, when I finally have product to sell, I'm not starting at zero then. I've actually at least maybe tried to build up a little bit of attention for myself. And so that's pretty much what I did. And so I started doing like 2 YouTube videos a week while I was starting with the ducks and raising the ducks. And when they first showed up and the experience of going from there, I've also had these trees here that I've been maintaining. And so I knew that in a couple of years, I'd have tree crops that I'd be selling. And so it was, again, I was trying to build the brand simultaneously with trying to build the farm, which I know is not the usual thing. And I know some will poo-poo it, but I feel like that's what helps set me up so that as I do other products now, I've got a built-in audience ready to go. And that's where, back to my point of, you can either focus on production or you can focus on your distribution. I lean heavily on the distribution side of things.
Okay, so you're talking about you have a background in marketing, and you're talking about building your audience and building your market before you even have a product to sell and before they even know that they want to buy it, which I totally dig. And I think where we've gone wrong in agriculture with farming and ranching is so many of us aren't great marketers, and we've given up our market power to things like the beef checkoff. Oh, just give us $1 off every head you sell. We'll promote your product for it. Or, the chicken, or there's no chicken checkoff because that's all vertically integrated before they had a chance. But, they did it with a pork checkoff, soybean checkoff, corn checkoff. I mean, you name it. There's a board or organization that's responsible for promoting almost everything. And that's because we suck at marketing. I suck at marketing. I'm trying to get better. But really, that's kind of the critical part about farming and ranching is, yeah, we can grow something. Great. Who's going to buy it? And you hit on something important, like everybody's got backyard chickens. So if you have backyard chickens and you're selling your eggs for $1, you're killing the rest of the industry. Either give the damn things away or charge $5. Charge an honest price or give them away.
And I completely agree with that. And I have long felt, and this is why I don't do, I do egg production and sales now. Most of my focus is on selling fertilized eggs through the mail, where I can charge a premium for it. Eating eggs, both chicken and duck, I do like locally here, but it's much more just to get rid of them. And yeah, I charge, I think it's like, I do $6 a dozen for duck eggs and $5 a dozen for chicken eggs. And like that is reasonable. People will pay that. But it's not a focus, because even at that price, the margin isn't even good enough for me to want to expand out and really try to get scale. The ducks are here for my basically my breeding stock, and the chickens are here to help fly control with my cattle and give me some farm chicken eggs. Like, that's the only reasons they're here. The commercial offshoot of that is just simply a byproduct. But I think you're right. Too oftentimes people will just be, especially like a homesteader who's just starting, and they're inundated with eggs, and you can always see these giant baskets of eggs that they've collected over a week or two, not realizing that, yeah, if you have 2 dozen chickens, you're going to be getting, easily a couple hundred eggs a week. That sort of thing is like not something people are used to. And so, yeah, they want to make $2 off of them, but that actually hurts more than just giving it away. I completely agree.
So something I was just thinking about, you said, the chickens are there to provide fly control for your cows, and that's their primary, and maybe a few eggs for you, and not to make money. And I appreciate that. Maybe we can unpack that a little bit, because they're not just doing fly control, they're also adding fertility. They're doing some light tillage on the ground. And there's a lot of benefits that they're bringing to the ecosystem that aren't necessarily tangible benefits you can attach a dollar value to, but you can attach a dollar value to the fly control. Like, and I'm not saying that you might have these figures, but if you don't have to do pour on your cattle because they don't have any flies, because you have chickens controlling your fly larvae and the manure pats, that's a cost savings that can be attributed to the chickens.
Yes. So, I mean, there's some complexity there, though, right? And yeah, like, all right,
it
so
seems real
that
simple,
30
right?
bottle, that $30 bottle of Ultra Boss that, for my hurt, like, I mean, like, if you try to do the math there, but I'm genuinely trying to avoid using permethrin, avoiding using like things like ivermectin, just simply because the more I've been doing this, and I'm still so much of a beginner, I don't mean to emphasize like I have expertise at all, but the more I've been doing this, the more I'm realizing that my job as the farmer, more than anything else, is to be the balancer of an ecosystem where, I've got some, call them anchor features of them, including the grass, the trees, the cattle. But then I have some, call them helper activities that exist there. So things like my chickens, which are helping in terms of managing pests and insects, and yeah, providing some light soil disturbance. I have things like my livestock guardian dogs, right, which are providing predator protection. So we do non-lethal predator control here. So I've got 2 livestock guardian dogs who help keep, essentially a bubble around and act in the role of the apex predator, keeping the coyotes and the bobcats and the foxes away from my birds. All of my ducks, geese, and chickens all actually free range during the summer months 24/7. So I don't lock them up. I have a perimeter fence and dogs, and that's it. And I haven't lost anybody in a couple of years now in doing that type of setup. But that's again because of the ecosystem. I even have barn cats, right? Because if you have poultry like ducks and chickens, you need to feed them grain. That grain attracts rodents. Those rodents attract disease as well as attract other predators because coyotes' favorite things to eat are mice. And so by having the barn cats there, they're suppressing the rodent population, which is also trying to keep things in balance. And so what I'm finding, the more and more that I've been working on my farm, is the more and more I need to think about how things create a balance. And so yes, there's the added benefit of I don't have to use a pour-on to manage my fly populations. But what I'm also finding is it's not like simple, like you just need chickens. Like I found I need to do a little trapping to manage my fly numbers too. But at the advantage of not doing the pour-on is you could argue that some of the micro life in the soil is a little bit better off because I'm not putting a pour-on on. Like, and so your point of trying to find an economic benefit is true and fair. I have done a very poor job of trying to discover that myself. But what I am seeing is holistically, as all these things kind of start to work together, there's a benefit in that.
And I think you're on a great point. Like there's a lot of things that we might not be able to economically quantify, but there's a lot of things that we can ecologically qualify.
100%. And here's the thing. When I do a business case for any of the products I have on my farm, like I'm going to go to the cattle, the trees, the geese, especially, I'm running that business case as a standalone. So how much is it costing me to keep these cattle? How much am I spending on a, monthly or annual basis to manage them? What am I going to get as a return? And like seeing if those numbers work out. I actually just sent my first steer off to the processor last week. And so
that's exciting.
Oh yeah, no. So the case is still open on that one, but I did do a whole set of numbers and assumptions to get there. My geese, which I've been doing geese for meat for 3 years now, are
wait a minute. You said meat geese?
Meat geese, yeah.
I assumed that you were doing eggs with those.
No. So I do breeding stock and meat with the geese. All right, this is going to go a whole nother tangent, but let me make the case that geese are the most ecologically sustainable form of poultry you can raise. They're better than ducks. They're better than chickens. They're better than turkeys. Ducks, chickens, and turkeys, right? You got to bring in grain. You got to bring in feed. You've got all of this input cost. In an ecosystem like ours here in Vermont, where we have great grass growth for about 6 months a year, what I'm able to do is hatch out my geese here on the farm. And then after about week 4 or 5, switch their diet over to where they're getting about 90% of their diet from the pasture. So they're eating grass, they're eating weeds.
Because geese are grazers.
Yeah, I mean, they're not, they don't have the same kind of ruminant stomach setup as like a sheep or a cow, but they are grazers. They get most of their diet from that grass. And so my input costs on my geese to get like a 20-pound goose that I can charge, $14 a pound for, I'm able to actually do that with less grain than it's taking to feed my, 4 or 5 pound egg laying ducks. And so, the fact that there's such a little input there becomes how I make that business case. And so, yeah, there's like a whole spreadsheet, and I've done like YouTube videos on it where I go through the spreadsheet on the assumptions of how much does it cost to raise and produce a gosling? How much does it cost to, feed them over the course of the year? I have my butchering week that we do here next week for all my poultry. So all the birds that aren't going to stay around for winter for breeding stock go into the freezer. And then that's when I start to do my sales again. And so, yeah, it's like you got to build a business case for that by itself. Do the geese have other benefits in terms of, helping, essentially clean up behind the cattle? They definitely do. I'm not trying to economically quantify it though, because they already stand by themselves economically. And to your point, it's more a qualitative ecological impact that I'm happy to reap that benefit, even though I'm not going to try to assign the number just because I don't see the point in doing it. Like I wouldn't act any differently.
I think we might spend a lot of time chasing our tails trying to quantify, ecological benefits like that in terms of dollars. I don't think it's possible because you can't replicate the complex dance of biology with a solution in a bottle.
Completely. I mean, look, here's something that I feel like I've learned from my time in corporate America. When we would very regularly do budgeting exercises for departments and doing pricing exercises for new products, and like the, kind of lick your finger, put it up to the wind type of math that would have to happen to make some of these wild ass assumptions that people are definitely just pulling out of their butt. Like, it was just a big waste of time. And so now that I'm a small business owner myself, now that I'm doing my own thing, I really try to focus my energy on doing planning and assumptions for things that matter versus the things that don't. Like asking myself the question, how will I act any differently if I know these numbers versus if I don't? And to your point, like make the decision whether or not I should chase my tail.
Okay. So let's talk about how to start a farm now.
I mean, and I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. I mean, like let me like be 100% transparent, right?
Oh, I suffer from imposter syndrome constantly. But there's no such thing as the grazing police.
Right.
If there was, there's a lot of folks around me that would probably be in serious trouble with the grazing police if such a thing existed. So there's nobody called the grazing police that's going to come tell you how you're doing it wrong. There's no regenerative agriculture police that are going to come write you a ticket for doing regenerative agriculture wrong. Like guys can go load up with Roundup and go spray that. So that's okay. Nobody's going to judge us.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, look, what I have found that has personally worked for me has been start small and focus on profitability. So again, back to that point of, kind of mistake number one I see people is they jump in with both feet, when I'd argue you're much better dipping some toes in and seeing if you like the temperature of the water versus like taking the full plunge.
Going to the bank and getting $1 million and buying a couple thousand acres and a couple hundred head. And yeah.
It's like I can't like it's hard enough being a beginning farmer and struggling and trying to figure stuff out and learn stuff without the pressure of a whole bank note you got to pay down on, and like you got to like make sure you can feed your family and do like don't do that to yourself right out of the gate. Start small. I think that's number one. But then number two, focus on being profitable. Focus on, trying to price your products appropriately, trying to find a market. Don't try to scale up until you have confidence in that market. I think, as much as people like to focus on production in agriculture, I think the market development and distribution strategy is arguably more of the success defining factor when you think about the long-term sustainability of a farm.
I agree. So kind of continuing in the marketing vein, I know you don't like farmers markets, and I get why. And we've heard that. Podcast listeners will know that we've heard it a dozen times already, that farmers markets are a great place to go get exposure, but not a great place to generate a lot of sales. Oftentimes it's a break even or a money losing operation to go to farmers markets. Does that track with you?
This, much like your land management practices, I feel like is it depends on your context type of question. So I live in the second least populated state in the United States, in the poorest, most rural corner of that state, in a town of 700 people. From a market development standpoint, I either can sell locally here to a very few people who don't even necessarily want to pay a premium for my product, or I can hop in the truck and drive to Burlington and maybe have a slightly bigger market, but now I'm got to drive 90 minutes there or 90 minutes back, or hop in the truck and drive down to Boston, which is 3 hours away, which is a bigger market, and would be able to sustain what I want to do from a profitability standpoint. But then that's 3 hours down and 3 hours back that I'd be doing like once a week. And all of that seems horrible to me, versus the fact that because I've built a strong brand in social media and built a pretty big footprint across, all the major platforms, that gives me the opportunity to do internet sales. And so, for example, as I get ready to do my goose harvest and duck harvest, I'm 100% sold out on ducks. I've got a couple of geese still left over. But at this point, everybody's purchased my product already through my website, and I'm ready to go. One of the other things I'm doing with my beef, right, is I'm creating a line of beef tallow soap. I know I have a customer base that's going to be ready to buy it on day one, the minute I list it on my website, if I just do like a quick live stream to promote it. Like,
Right.
again, it's recognizing my context is very different than, say, your context. And so it kind of depends. If it was me and I had a family and I had a whole bunch of people working with me, it might make perfect sense to start selling down in Boston too, and I could scale up more and sell in Boston. But it just doesn't make sense for my situation. I think depending on where your farm's located, depending on what that market looks like, and depending on what your time and labor situation is, farmers markets could be great for you. The reason I challenge kind of the small farm orthodoxy of, hey, you need to be thinking about farmers markets as your mode of distribution, is because I think people automatically put themselves in a box versus really stepping back and saying, what would be the most advantageous play for me given the context of my farm?
What's the easiest way for me to get my product in front of my customers that don't even know they want it?
Exactly, exactly. And where do I have demand and where don't I? And it's much easier to sell into a market where there's already demand versus trying to create demand yourself. Which, if we want to come back to, how I said I started with duck eggs, the reason I don't do duck eggs for eating as a real business line anymore is because there was no demand. I was finding I had to create the demand, and that's a lot more work versus, people who want to hatch ducks is a market to itself. I can charge a premium for that, and I'm not limited geographically, and I can do my sales over the internet. So let me focus there instead. And it's being able to recognize the landscape and shift your business model to match that landscape too.
Okay. And with your geese, your revenue generator with the geese is just the meat. You're not doing eggs with the geese.
I also do fertilized egg sales with the geese. And so it's like, 4 fertilized goose eggs can fetch you $60 or $65 shipping paid. That was what I was charging this past year. And I was pretty much always sold out. And so that's one part of the business model. Exactly. But now if I'm thinking about my goose business, right? And this is where, as a business line, geese are like one big thing, but there's a couple facets to it. Geese only lay eggs from, call it, February to mid to late May. So it's a tight window.
And,
But
and
what
they're not very prolific producers, are they? They don't produce very many eggs.
your average female will push out 3, maybe 4 eggs during peak laying season, in those months. And so, what I will do is typically from February to early April, it's much too early for me to hatch eggs here. And so that's when I'm selling my eggs, in the mail. And when I do that, essentially I'm covering most of my feed costs for the winter, because while geese are really, really cheap and easy to raise in the summer, they can be kind of pricey to raise in the winter because they need a lot of food and they're not getting it from the pasture when we have 4 feet of snow on the ground. And so, that part offsets my costs. I'm able to still have breeding geese though, so I can do my own hatching on farm, which, so rather than paying about $22 to $24 per gosling if I was buying from a hatchery, I'm essentially hatching them for free because I've already covered my breeding parent cost by selling the hatching eggs in the early part of the season. And now basically I have these hatchlings that are relatively cheap to raise that I can then charge a premium for when I harvest them in early October for meat. So it's like it's an enterprise that has multiple facets, but they all kind of fit together into the bigger business strategy, and it takes advantage of my climate, my seasons, my context.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about that since you mentioned winter feeding on the geese, and I'm assuming, like, I just have this some reason I have this vision in my head of like a Power Wheel size little feed truck with a little miniature round bale, and he's going out and he's unrolling it in front of the herd of ducks that are following along like cows. I know that's completely off base.
No, you can't feed geese hay.
So what do you feed geese in the winter?
It's grains and cracked corn. Basically it's not that different than chicken or duck feed. You just want to reduce your protein a little bit, and so usually I'll add like cracked corn to cut that. But that's basically it.
Okay, so that I guess we're kind of dancing around. You're in northern Vermont, which is obviously far north, a lot farther north than I am. And you said you have snow on the ground, 4 feet of snow on the ground for the year. So let's talk about like your forage chain. Obviously right now you're probably getting ready to come out of pasture and start heading towards the barns. So how do you care for lack of a better term, your menagerie of livestock um, during the winter in the barns, and how do you store up feed for them?
Yeah, so I mean, the farm has kind of two, maybe three configurations. There's like winter configuration and summer configuration. We're still in summer configuration. I'd hope to be in summer configuration into, call it, mid to late October, but essentially it becomes weather dependent. If we get a big snowstorm in late October, everybody comes in and we're just done. Um, when it comes to the, ducks, geese, and chickens, what I've actually found is the best way to house them is in like a large greenhouse. I had a 50 by 12 greenhouse that I was keeping all my birds in last year. I'm in the process of finishing right now. We're actually rolling out the plastic tomorrow. 100 by 20 foot hoop house, essentially. That's going to house all of my birds, and I'm going to actually be trying to grow some of their feed in there in the summer months. And so basically I kind of house them in there. They have like a little yard that they can go into, but rather than being free range, they're now kind of partially housed in this hoop coop, as well as housed in like they have like an outdoor paddock. The
Are
cattle,
they is everything commingled, or do you have like different sections for chickens, ducks, and geese?
so in years past, I've had everybody separate. Last year, I combined the geese and chickens together. That worked out pretty well. This year, I'm going to try combining the ducks, geese, and chickens all together. I believe that should work out pretty well. They segregate themselves essentially in terms of how they want to sleep and how they want to like kind of spend their time. Like, the chickens are going to want to roost, the geese and ducks are going to want to be on the ground. And they basically build nests out of straw. And so they kind of do it for you. And so it's not that different from that perspective.
I was just
So
I was
yeah.
just wondering if there was like if there was competition, or the geese. My experience with geese are dicks. Like geese are assholes. Like that's
Well,
just my
so
experience with them.
I'll call that a little bit of a myth. So during breeding season and mating season, they can be very aggressive. If you're going in there and taking eggs out of their nest, I've gotten bites on my fingers before, like that can definitely happen. But overall, especially because every goose on our farm, pretty much every goose on our farm, I've raised from at least a day old or younger. And so I've been in a kind of ever present, so I never have any trouble working with them. They essentially all the birds will establish a pecking order. And so when you commingle your birds, the ducks, geese, and chickens also have their pecking order. The geese are at the top of the pecking order. You just resolve that. They're always going to be the ones that eat first out of the trough. They're going to be the ones that push everybody out of the way. But once they have their fill, they're actually very good about getting out of the way. And then the ducks and chickens come in. And so as long as you're not like scarcity feeding them, it's not a big deal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm talking like, last year I had about 50 geese that I overwintered. So this isn't like a tiny, like, I got three geese and, 10 ducks. Like it was, good sized population.
Well, it's also not like, you've got a confinement barn with 40,000 of them either.
Oh, completely. I mean, making, that space piece, I think is a biggie, right? Where, like my bird yard, the one that they have access to in the summer, it's like that's 10 acres of space that they can go to. And so that keeps a lot of problems and kind of violence and flock fighting from happening just by having that space that everybody can spread out, just that alone.
Because what's the rule for cage free or free range when they can label that
It's
on
something. It's
eggs?
something
It's
like
like 1 square foot or some
it's
bullshit.
1 or 2 square feet. Yeah, it's something ridiculous. Which, if you actually think about what that looks like, it's like that's not good at all.
Like one chicken for 2 square feet and calling that free range would be like one of us trying to live in a tiny house for a year.
even worse than that. It'd be like one of us living in a closet for a year. Like, I mean, it's not good. It's yeah. I think that's where you're gonna have your flocks picking on each other, and you're gonna have rises in cannibalism and that sort of thing. It's when you have that factor of space reduced. I mean, that makes a big difference.
Okay, so kind of getting back to the weather, and I should have done this
Yeah.
earlier. I have a friend in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, who runs a restaurant, and I was talking to him this morning, and he says, his name's Luke. He says it would be cool to learn about the difficulties that come with raising livestock in the harsh New England weather, specifically the 6 months of cold and snow.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, so with the birds, I constantly have water freezing and I'm breaking that up. But birds themselves are actually pretty hardy. That's partially why I've always been so focused on ducks and geese. From a cold hardy perspective, they're really good in the cold. I specifically choose breeds of chickens that are good, small combs, good for cold hardiness as well, just for that reason. I've had a little bit of frostbite in the past, but it's never been too bad. But yeah, we can get negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit pretty regularly. We can go a week or two with never getting over 0 degrees Fahrenheit for a chunk of time. And so that part is hard, but you get used to it. With the cattle, so last year was my first year of housing the cattle in the winter. Number one, I went with a hardy breed there. We have Scottish Highlands. And so that makes a difference. Like, if I had like Coriani or something, right? I don't think they would work in this context nearly as well. Maybe they might.
I think your grass is way too good for Corianes to do well.
I don't know. Highlands, I've got some real crap grass, and Highlands do pretty good with crap grass too. So like, but I have a hardier breed, and so the way it works is I basically create a yard, around my barn. I have this gigantic 3-story former dairy barn. I keep them in the basement of that so they can get a shelter if they need it. I have a water trough that's heated because I have electricity in the barn, and so that's where they'll get their water. But they usually still spend most of their time outside in the yard. And then I'm typically feeding either dry or silage round bales over the course of the winter to them. And I basically do that from probably early November to early-ish May is kind of the window that I'm feeding them that hay. I got everything just got it fully loaded up here for the winter. I'm ready to go, as well as a couple of additional cattle that we're going to be adding pretty soon. And so I'm ready for winter. I'm just basically now at the point of, as soon as I get a big snowstorm, I'll probably move them in, because the way the snow works here, and this is where, when you debate people who say, oh, you should never feed your cattle hay, we're going to get a snowstorm in
I
probably,
won't even say you should never feed
I,
hay.
I know I'm exaggerating.
I won't even say that.
I'm exaggerating, but I guess the point is this: we will get a snowstorm in early November, and we will not see the ground again until late April at the earliest. And essentially, we'll get snowstorm after snowstorm. It'll accumulate until you get to the point where, yeah, you got about 3 or 4 feet if you get a good heavy winter. And it doesn't matter if they're Scottish Highlands with their big horns and they're, kind of able to dig through. They're not going to be able to access anything that you have underneath that ground. And so, creating a setup where you can efficiently feed hay and you have the ability to kind of bring your animals in, that's what I've found is sort of the need. But then, the second that things sort of start to perk up and I start to see some green grass of May, boom, I'll try to put them back outside again, even if it's giving them more space than they have. Because I'm at this point trying to do 2 pasture moves a day most days with the cattle. So, relatively small grazing cell, open that up, kind of do it again. And I've been finding that that's working really great so far this whole summer. And I'll be back to doing that again next spring.
Awesome. So I was trying to place northern Vermont like with latitude on a map. Is where you're at, you're kind of about where North Dakota would be, like similar latitude, or
yeah, kind of. I mean, it's a slightly different climate because of mountains and weather patterns
and the Atlantic current.
Yeah. But yeah, no. So we're about 50 miles south of the Canadian border. So, pretty much up there. Elevation wise, and I know people out west are going to scoff, but here it's high. I think we're about 1,400 feet or so. And I go,
I'm like, my elevation's like over 2,000 feet.
I know, but look here. It's like Vermont is like the Green Mountain State, even though
right.
we're in the mountains here. Like and so that gets us pretty cold. Yeah, North Dakota I think would be a fair-ish comparison, depending on what part of North Dakota. North Dakota is a relatively big state compared to Vermont.
Yeah, I was just trying to place, I was just trying to make sure I had a concept of where you were, north south.
Yeah, I think we are at like almost the 45th line there.
Oh wow, yeah. So that's a lot farther north than I am. I don't know what latitude I'm at, but I know I'm about 98.35 longitude on the wrong side of that 100 line. Let's see. So where do we go? You're talking about having 4 feet of snow and your highlands can't quite get under it, and you're talking about the weather. We'll get the cold, we'll get the snow, but then it warms right back up. So like the worst, we've kind of almost had the 2 worst winters we've had that I can ever remember. So winter of 20 or February of 2021, we had like 14 days where it didn't thaw. We had 13 days where the sun didn't come out. And that whole business started off with a 1/2 inch ice storm. So we had a 1/2 inch ice come in and cover everything up. And it got down, like, I think it was 10 or 12 degrees that morning when we got out there. And it's like, okay, there's a 1/2 inch ice. And I'm sitting in pasture stockpile that was well over 2,000 pounds an acre. So we're talking waist high grass in a lot of places. Okay, we're covered up with ice. Time to go get some hay. So I went and I got a bale of feed and a bale of alfalfa, and I rolled them both out. And my 100 cows just kept walking back and forth. So I sat there and I watched and saw what they were doing. So all the snow and ice came in on a north wind. So it caught on the north side of all the plants and all my tall stockpile. So what they do is they would start at the south end of the pasture and they would just kind of line out east to west, and they would go on this grazing path from south to north, and they had their heads down and they were looking underneath all that stockpile on the lee side of all that grass and the sagebrush and everything, and they could still go in and find green grass to eat underneath the snow and ice.
Oh, they will find it any way they can. I mean, even my animals will, like, you can see the edge of the fence, right? And you can see them like just sticking their nose through it to get like those last little bits of green nubbin that come because the fence heats up a little bit more, melts the ice a little bit more. Like cattle are remarkable animals when it comes to finding the best available forage. I think the tricky thing is like to what you just described, right? It sounds like that's like atypical conditions. I think it's actually harder to be in that type of setting where you can have to deal with that surprise versus ours where we have such, kind of stout winters that we just have to go into winter mode. And
November to March or November to May is gonna suck.
Yeah, exactly. Like, not suck, but it's just I know I have to feed them with the tractor. Like I know that like that's baked into my plan, and so I just just like with the ducks and geese, I know I got to run them water 3 times a day, and that their water troughs are going to be frozen. So I want rubber water troughs that I can just stomp, empty, and be able to refill again instantly. Versus trying to thaw out an ice pond or try to fight the ice. It's just you build a way to farm based on your context, and you can go with it. When you get those curveballs, that throws you off. Like for me, actually, the biggest curveball is like a January thaw. And like if it heats up and suddenly I have a week or two where it's like 40, which happened this past year, which was like weird. Then I've got mud everywhere where I didn't expect mud. I've got, messes coming together. It's turning it like, things are falling apart. Like it's not what I want to see. Like that's actually a bigger problem for me. So it's not so much the harsh condition, it's the unexpected abnormal condition that I think is much harder to contend with.
I would agree with that. And the cold that we've had the last 2 years in February has definitely been unexpected. You know, I can remember a year, there was one year where we got over 6 feet of snow in the winter, and it came in three big dumps. And I think one dump was, it was 2 feet, then one was 3 feet, and then one was 2 feet. But mostly, that's a 4 or 5 day event. And I was going back through before I bought my cattle. So let's clarify here. So I've been on the ranch, been out of the Navy and back on the ranch since 2006. I didn't buy cows until 2020. So I'm fairly new at this too. But I did spend a lot of years growing other people's cattle, taking care of other people's cattle, and understanding
Custom grazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And understanding how to graze the ranch and how the forage, and how the forage grows and responds, and all that stuff. So I think I understand my grass and my land a lot better than I understand how to use it correctly with cattle. I'm still learning. Um, but like I said, I'm kind of new to it too, and figuring out the marketing is a challenge. And I forgot where I was going with that. Oh, but as before I bought the cows, I was kind of going back through, all of Dad's weather records, and what everything was, what the winters have been like. Because my dad, bless his heart, has kept really good precipitation and temperature records since like 1984. Like, he journaled for years.
Wow.
Like, and he would make an observation about what the weather was doing and what the weather was. And he's been tracking rainfall. He tracks rainfall to the 100th of an inch. I'm not quite that crazy. I'll just track it to the 10th and be good. But he likes to track those hundreds. How much rain did you get? I had 67 hundredths. Oh, I had 70, Dad. That's fine.
That's impressive though, to have that like kind of log, to be able to see the kind of what your land's been doing that long a period of time.
Oh, it gets even better than that, Morgan. We can chart grass growth in terms of inches of grass per acre, based on rainfall and based on temperature. So we kind of have an understanding of how the grass is going to grow through the year based on years and years of forage samples. We know when we're going to grow a lot of this, when we're going to grow a little of this, and when dormant season is, when we need to do different things. But so what I'm getting at is, I went through all of his weather records, and I looked at the National Weather Service archives, and I figured 14 days over the last 20 some odd years. 14 days is all that we're ever covered up on average during the winter. So that's all the hay that I have. I keep about 2 weeks of hay around to feed the cows, and that's it.
Right. And there you go. So you have this atypical, okay, I can expect a snowstorm or two type of situation, versus if you suddenly have snow coverage for 60 days, that blows you up, because that's the atypical for you.
Yeah, if I get a snowstorm that sticks around for more than 14 to 21 days,
Yeah.
I'm probably going to have a panic. And I was sitting here thinking, one of the worst things that could happen to me right now, or any time between now and say April 15th, would be to have a wildfire come through and nuke all my stockpiled grass. That actually happened up in northern Kansas last year. I think it was December 15th. There was a wildfire, burned something like 250,000 acres in a day. And without knowing anything about their situation, just thinking about, like, okay, what would I do on December 15th if I got burned out and my winter stockpile got burned out? I wouldn't have a choice. I'd have to take everything to town or go find another ranch for them to stand on, because there's no way that I'm going to feed hay from December 15 to April 15.
Right.
You're outside your mind that that's going to work.
Well, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I think here's another dimension too that, gets to, for everybody to think about their context. That's a difference for me, and why actually feeding hay makes sense. So I don't even make my own hay. I buy it from neighbors, because here where we are, there's a lot of properties that were farms at one point that are now owned as essentially second homes by folks in Boston and other parts of the country. And typically what they need is somebody to hay their field, because they want to keep the open pasture look. And so that creates a market for a couple of different farmers locally here who basically act as kind of land caretakers. They hay everybody's fields. They now have hay to sell that's relatively cheap, like I'm doing, kind of a big round bale of like silage hay, wrapped in plastic is like, $45. Yeah.
For what, like a 4x4, like a 800-900 pound bale?
Yeah.
Okay. So double that for the per ton cost.
Right. And so like it's not that bad. It's manageable. Like it's still a cost. It's an input cost, relatively speaking, but it's not that bad. And so like I'm able to get that supplied relatively easily. It's available. And it doesn't make sense for me to try to make it on my own land. So number one, I don't have to, give up that fertility and kind of mine the farm. And number two, I'm able to expand my herd out and support it. If that market were to change and suddenly that's not available anymore, I would need to rethink my strategy. But given the context of what I'm in right now, that also makes it very feasible to feed that hay.
So let's talk a little bit about hay, because you kind of opened the door for me to say something. So if we talk about buying hay just for the forage value that the hay represents, that's one thing. If we're buying hay if we're buying hay and we're thinking about it as I'm importing this fertility to my farm, and you're using that hay not only to feed animals, but you're also using that hay, with some other function to boost soil structure or feed the soil or build soil organic matter, or you're unrolling that hay on a bare spot to provide soil armor, so maybe some other plants will come in and have an opportunity to take root. Those have a far different value attached to them than just buying that bale for the forage value it represents to feed to an animal.
100% agree. So I probably should have said this sooner, right? But what I do with all my winter manure is, I mean, we use a little bit of it for our kitchen garden, but the vast majority of it gets put back out onto our trees. So back to that point of I have about 700 trees, chestnut, mulberry, apple, black locust, some walnut, some elderberry, like basically kind of all these trees and shrubs that we've been growing. I use that as fertilizer. That's basically what I'm using that hay and the manure for. And so, yeah, that saves me an input cost on that side of the business as well. And so, back to that point of, hey, I see myself as an ecosystem manager. That's just another level of management. So yeah, I do have that benefit. The top of our pasture was used, so we were originally a dairy farm, but then, from about 2000 to 2010, it was an organic vegetable farm. And then, they were basically doing row organic vegetables up top, but never really reseeded anything. Then it sat abandoned for about 6-7 years before we took it over. And so, basically reconditioning and rebuilding that top pasture has been something I've had to do too. And to your point, essentially doing kind of rolled out bales has been a nice way to like help improve some of that area as well.
And I think that's really underlooked, because I feel like a lot of guys get siloed into, when they're feeding hay, they just go feed it in a ring feeder, or put it in a bunk or whatever, and it's being fed in the same spot. And I always try to go to somewhere different when I'm unrolling a bale. Like when I'm unrolling a bale of supplemental alfalfa to supplement my protein ration, like I said, I'm looking for those bare spots, those bare thin spots. Maybe I'm looking for a patch of really, really tall, rank big blue stem that's 7 feet tall that the cows haven't been in 4 years. Maybe the thing to do there is to roll the bale through it and let them just pound that grass that they're not going to eat anyway. Let them pound it into dirt, open up the canopy so something else can come in. But adding, when you feed that bale, whether you unroll it or you feed it in a ring feeder or, whatever scheme you want to use, you can use that as a tool to concentrate your animals in an area. And you can take advantage of that herd effect to do different things, to, use all those hooves in an area to break down some brush, that concentrated manure and urine to add fertility back, some of the quote waste hay that's on the ground. Well, if it gets pounded into the ground to feed soil microbes, is it waste?
No, I think that that's exactly right. And, one of the things, cattle have been the newest animal that I added to my farm. It won't be the last animal that I add to my farm. But one of the things I wonder is, are cattle going to be truly an anchor animal on the farm where it's like, I ultimately want to expand out to say, probably could on this property support like say 60 head of cattle and be able to do that? Or and are they just going to be kind of an element because of what they can do with their heavy hoof disruption? And I should maybe be thinking about other things like sheep because, and this gets back to the business case, right? While sheep have, worse parasite problems and the efficiency of butchering a sheep and like what you get versus the cost of butchering sucks, there is this advantage of if I can harvest my lambs in like say late October, I'm not having to pay, do the whole 18-month cycle that I typically have to do with a steer here, which is going to save me money, which is maybe a better why. I mean, part of why I went with a smaller breed of cattle like the Scottish Highland versus say, like a Charolais or Belted Galloway or something like that, like a bigger animal, is just because then I'd be 2 years in and then I'm feeding 2 years of hay. That just seems crazy to me if I'm going to make the business case for a steer work. And so I go into all of this and saying, kind of thinking about those costs and those benefits and how they fit with other things is a big part of how I'm constantly evaluating the farm and saying, how many animals do I want to have? But to your point, that qualitative ecological impact of cattle and what they can do for the land, I think I'm always going to have cattle just because of that reason.
Yeah, and I can see that. And I was just thinking that, where you're at, it's probably a very similar environment to the Scottish Highlands, like climate wise, forage wise. It's probably, on order of 80% similarities.
Yeah, I mean, I think we get a little bit colder, but for the most part, yeah, they were hill farms and we're hill farms. It's small, tight parcels of land intermixed with a lot of forest, lots of steep, kind of uneven pasture. Very much is what we have here too.
Kind of like why I have Coriolis, because that's an animal that should be able to succeed on, in a dry, hot environment on poor forage. Scottish Highlander, it should work well for you.
Oh, it's exactly it. Like, I mean, to back where I said I don't think I'd ever want to have them up here. Much like I look at people like out in say like Southern Oklahoma who have Scottish Highlands, and it's like, yeah, I guess you can do it out there, but is that the best, animal for that context? Like, I don't know. I think sometimes, that's really something people should think more about.
You won't see somebody with 30 Scottish Highlanders out here. You'll see somebody with 3 because they're pets because the wife wanted them or the girlfriend thought they were cute. That's generally
they
why
are
you'll
the
see
most metal
Highlanders
of
out here.
cattle. I'll give it that. Like, they are cool looking. I mean, that's the added benefit, but depending on your climate, they might not be the best option either.
I actually had a friend that had a few. He was a cow trader, had a ranch down the road from me. He had to sell out and move a few years ago. And his wife, she was a really neat lady. And like the one time he took her to the cattle sale, they came home with 3 Highlanders and they lived in the wheat pasture right by the house. So mama could go out and have her coffee and she could look at her 3 Highlander steers. And it was really funny because Ed and their oldest daughter, Grace, kept threatening they kept threatening to turn him into a pair of woolies.
Yeah, no, here's actually one of the things I struggle with too. And again, this is by virtue of being kind of a very public farm on the internet, where I keep looking at what the sale costs of are for steers and bull calves that are Highlands and recognize that I probably could even add a little bit of, hey, look, these are semi-famous cows, so I can get like a little premium. It actually makes it hard to want to raise beef because what that cattle market looks like right now. I know that cattle markets are cycles, and I know that we are on the upswing of a cycle right now, particularly for Highlands. But it does make me wonder, like, how do you balance creating food, which I really do genuinely want to be an objective of my farm, versus driving the most economic impact? And sometimes those are not the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can see that with the cattle market. And I think that I'm going to go ahead and throw this out there and I'll go ahead and say this on the podcast. I think that over the next 18 months, I think the high input, high octane genetics that take a lot of grain inputs to succeed, I think we're going to start seeing those fall out of favor as input costs and diesel fuel prices continue to rise, and cattle like yours and cattle like mine that are being developed on grass and that are being pushed on grass, I hope they're going to be more valuable in the future than they are currently.
Yeah, no, I think call it, Hobbes says low input ranching or something. Like, yeah,
Collapse ranching, I think,
yeah,
is
yeah,
one
is
of
his
his
term.
latest
Yeah, yeah,
terms.
yeah. Like it's, I think it's something along those lines. I think is going to be the case. One of the things I'm exploring too, like I haven't talked about this much, but I think you'll actually appreciate this. So I am getting a couple of Charolais cattle from a farm on the other side of a hill, basically. The guy's been raising them there for 30 plus years, and just he's got animals perfectly suited for his land, which is pretty much exactly like my land. I also have a Highland bull coming, and so my plan is going to be trying to do Charolais Highland hybrids with the mothers being Charolais, so you don't have any calving issues. Because you got the smaller Highland bull father.
Right.
And I'm curious to see how those animals perform, because I think oftentimes we get fixated on the pure breed when probably that hybrid that has kind of just the right elements of mom and just the right elements of dad for your land might be the best option, to your point of the low input, suited for the land type of farming that I think is going to need to happen over the next decade or so.
I definitely think there's a huge value in hybrid vigor and heterosis, from different breeds. You can take a hybrid like that. And I like Charolais as a hybrid, don't get me wrong, so I'm not going to say anything bad about him. I got friends that raise them. Charolais on Corriente, there's people doing that maternal cross. I haven't really unpacked any of that yet. But most people that do Corriente and Charolais are doing that for a terminal animal. And I get the whole calving ease question. This isn't something I've personally done. Now, we know our friend Hobbs, Fire and Salt. He had to pull some calves out of Charolais bulls and Corriente cows. Anecdotally, I know some other folks that have used. I know a guy that used Charolais bulls on Corriente cows for years, and he never pulled a single thing. So maybe that's, and I think that's kind of subjective. That's, depends on the cows you have, depends on the bulls you have. But more to the point, there's a lot of value in the hybrid vigor and the heterosis. Even a lot of quote Angus steers that go to the feedlot, they're half or 3/4 Angus. They've got some Hereford in them or some other kind of continental in them or some other English in them, because that's what happened to fit that, that particular rancher's context. And even we can think about breeds like Beefmaster. We can think about a breed like the South Pole. We can even think about the Santa Gertrudis cattle. All three of those, they're all hybrid breeds that are or composites that were made from 4 other different breeds.
Right.
And why were they made from 4 different breeds? Because there wasn't a single breed that fit the context of what those cattlemen needed. So they made their own.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those interesting things, right? Because I mean, isn't that essentially the definition of a landrace breed, right? Where it's like, you're essentially raising something suited for the context that you're in. I wonder if that's actually going to become bigger and bigger, because as more people maybe try to shy away from the sale barn model and go more direct to consumer, you start to find that benefit that comes there as well, in terms of raising animals from your land, suited for your land, to be sold from your land, kind of like sort of that full kind of complete circle.
And I'll make the comment right now, and go ahead and email me at redhillsrancher.com all your hate comments. Angus cows will succeed anywhere because we have access to cheap feed and cheap diesel fuel. And it worked when diesel was $3. It worked when hay was under $100 a ton. It works when cubes are $200 a ton. But when we're looking at $300 hay and $400 cubes, and fat cattle are $1.75, it doesn't work. $9 corn, it doesn't work.
Yeah. So I mean, around here, so the majority of the farms that are still operating around me now are conventional dairy, where the model is basically they're growing corn, setting that aside, feeding that in the winter, also maybe some silage, and that's how they're doing it with the big Holstein cows. Like that's the majority of the farms around me. Um, but I'm starting to see more and more shifting, either going to specialty milk and probably shifting to like either brown Swiss or a Jersey, or they're going to just get out of the dairy business altogether because they can't make it work economically. I don't think beef is that far behind that shift, but that shift is happening, especially around here in dairy as we speak. And I think in a decade from now, the amount of dairies in my area will maybe be cut in half.
That's scary.
Yeah.
It's scary as hell. And you're right. You know, the sale barns exist for a reason, just like grain elevators exist for a reason. Are you familiar? You know, grain
Yeah.
elevator,
Yeah.
grain marketing
Yeah.
co-op. You know, they're great. Um, but say like a local farmers co-op, they might only have 6 different crops that they will accept. So, you know, if you got a 3,000 acre farm and you're trying to make machinery payments and get operating loans that you need to have crop insurance for, you know, that even narrows your list of crops down so much more of what you can get insurance on, because if you have a loan, you got to have insurance to be able to pay the loan, right? So guys will get siloed in like, well, all I can grow here is wheat. I can grow, you know, I can grow wheat, I can grow Milo, I can grow, you know, maybe 1 or 2 other things that the co-op might accept. But everybody around here grows wheat, so that's just what we're going to do. Or, you know, everybody around here has black cows. Well, where do you sell them? Well, we take them to the sale barn. And it circles back to some of the conversation we had earlier, right? When we give up our market power far too easily. We don't want to deal with customers because honestly, that's why most of us get into this line of work, is because we're tired of dealing with people. We want to get out of the country where there aren't a bunch of people, so we won't have to deal with them all the time, right? And then we get, you know, a year or two down these livestock operations, go, well, shit, if I actually want to make this work, I can't just take them to the commodity barn and sell them at the commodity barn, because I'm going to end up like everybody else. I'm going to end up broke and poor and going out of business and not knowing why. We got to
Yeah.
do something different, and that difference is we have to connect more directly with our customers.
I think it's going to go in two directions. It's going to go exactly like what you're talking about, exactly what you're doing, what I'm doing, what a lot of other folks are doing, where it's figuring out a business model that's direct to consumer. And it's going to go to bigger and bigger scalable, call it factory farm shops. And I think the middle of the road producer is going to be the one that actually really struggles to kind of figure out a way to make it work, because I think, kind of
Well,
selling
those are
your
the dairy
product.
farms that I saw going out of business in your little story. It's not the big ones, because the big ones are just going to get bigger. They probably already sell to a co-op with a good marketing arrangement. And yeah, they might be on a razor thin profit margin, but their scale makes it workable. Then you get to the mid-sized guy that's operating on the same margin, selling to the same people. His costs go up by 1 or 2%, and that destroys the profit margin. Then what do you have? You have dairies going out of business. The small ones that are light and flexible enough to do things like direct to consumer raw milk sales, and, you know, sell off half the cows, bring in a bunch of chickens, you know, for eggs and chicken meat as another byline.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. That's, one of my neighbors who is a what I'll call a mid-size, right, where you had like 300 milk cows, um, which, for around here that's like a mid-size operation. That, like, he was finding that, particularly right around COVID, he was now having to pay money to produce milk, and so it's like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Time to change the business model. And he actually was super smart because he shifted their model towards actually producing heifers and raising heifers that get sold to the big guys. But like the economics of his business now are very different. But being able to make that shift was necessary, or else that farm would have gone belly up. I just think what I see as the saddest thing is, like, I have another neighbor. He's I believe third generation, maybe even further back, third generation dairy farmer in the same plot of land. And all he wants to do is raise his cows and milk his cows and call it a day. Yet he's also in that small, I think 250 head of cattle or 250 milk cows kind of size operation. That's just it's going to get harder and harder to keep that afloat. And unless he's willing to adapt, that decision is going to get made for him.
Yep. And let me guess, he's probably running big giant Holstein cows.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, you know, there's problems with the Holsteins. Like there's genetic problems with the Holsteins. I think something like 40% of Holstein cows can trace their lineage back to one bull. And I think that there's, you know, if you really get down to it, there's two bulls that are 60 to 70%, you know, common parentage with all the Holstein cows running around. And again, my opinion. So we've got some maybe some inbreeding happening in the dairy Holstein population at large, not pointing out anybody specific. And it's because they've got to chase that production number, right? It's how efficient is this cow at turning, you know, this high energy feed that we're putting into it? How much milk is she going to produce on that? And yeah, there's Holstein cows that'll make 100 pounds of milk a day, which is just absolutely phenomenal. But what have we sacrificed to get that giant amount of production? Did we screw up the lactose? Like, have we changed lactose? Is there less percentage of milk fat in the milk, and is it more watery? You know, what are we sacrificing?
What are your input costs on that cow? I mean, like, you're probably feeding a whole heck of a lot of corn to keep that animal running through the dead of winter. Like, it's all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, like, okay, let's feed an 1,800-pound Holstein because she's going to make 100 pounds of milk versus feeding two 600-pound jerseys that are each going to make 35.
Yes.
And I think the guys that are, you know, that are locked into that huge production mindset, that are still mid-size, that have never been able to scale up to a big producer and, you know, kind of break over. I think you're right. They're the ones that are at the extreme danger of going out if they don't change something.
You know, you brought up imposter syndrome too earlier, right? And I think that one of the absolute blessings I feel like I have, despite the fact that I sure do have that imposter syndrome, and, you know, people can still question, are you really a farmer and all that nonsense? I don't have the legacy and baggage of, well, this is how my dad did it. This is how my granddad did it. And because I'm a first generation farmer and I'm looking at it with fresh eyes, and I have, like, say, a business background that gives me a different way of thinking about how to start and run a business, that I see as an advantage for me, even though it comes with its own disadvantages. I think it's a challenge when you're multi-generation and you're trying to keep that same model going. It's so much harder to, you know, slaughter that sacred cow and shift the business model from what it was 30, 40, 60 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So as a first generation, you get to make all your own mistakes, right? You have the opportunity to make all the mistakes. So you probably have a neighbor, you know, you said you had a neighbor that's, you know, third, fourth generation. Grandpa already made those mistakes and told him about it. So he's like got a mental block. Like, I think when guys are, you know, multi-generational operation, or, you know, an operation that, you know, has a long history like that, a guy will get siloed in thinking, well, that's never worked here, so I'm just not going to try it, and have a mental block that they don't even know they have against trying a new practice.
Oh, completely. But I think there's a balance that needs to be struck too. So I have one neighbor right across the street over there. He's like in his 80s, and he has been farming the land across the street from me since the 50s. He's a source of information. I have another neighbor I share a back property line who has been there since the, I think, mid 60s. I have a couple of others who are down the road who have been doing it around this area their entire lives. And so to be able to talk to those people and to learn from those people and get advice from those people while I'm a new guy coming in and being a first generation farmer is important and useful. But I don't feel like it carries maybe the same baggage as, say, if I were to call up my dad and ask him what to do with the same plot of land that he was using, because to your point, it's like you get locked in. And so I think if you're not relying on your neighbors and you're not relying on what's been done in the past and what's happened in the past, I think you're ignoring an important piece of information, But at the same time, if you're putting too much stock into it and you're letting that guide all of your decisions, I think that's going to steer you wrong too. It's just a delicate balance that you think you ultimately need to strike there.
Yeah, it is. And staying open-minded is a large part of it. Staying open-minded to new ideas, staying open-minded, not just to new ideas, but also to maybe some of those hard conversations, hard probing questions that that maybe somebody in the business that's been in the business for 30 years is afraid to ask themselves. You know, that's something that's kind of, I was sitting here thinking, like, you don't have any education at all in ag and you're out there killing it. So
I'm doing okay.
You're doing okay. I mean,
killing it feels very strong.
okay, you're doing okay. Um, you're not outwardly struggling as much as a lot of other guys probably are. And I appreciate that. And I think that there's a value in not having a traditional ag background, because you haven't been educated, you haven't been told your whole life and in university about what doesn't work. You have to figure that out on your own. And so tell me how you've done that. Like, let's talk about you talked about some of your local mentors. Let's talk about maybe some that aren't quite so local, and some resources that you've used to build the foundation that you have in your head to run your farm.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a combination of things. I mean, yeah, my neighbors are important sources of information. When I was first getting started, I think I mentioned this earlier, right? It was reading books by guys like Mark Shepard and Joel Salatin and Gabe Brown and like folks like that, kind of seeing some of the things that they talk about and letting that kind of shape my view. I think it was going out and visiting farms when I was just curious about farms back in the day and talking to folks who aren't of a, call it like a Joel Salatin celebrity status, right? And are just some dude raising goats in, rural Virginia. Kind of spending time with those folks and seeing kind of how that works. I think that's part of it. And this is a big part of why I went to YouTube, right? YouTube videos are tremendous. And yes, they're packaged, and yes, you can't believe everything you see, and yes, you got to take some of it with a grain of salt. But it's also, particularly for me, like where I'm a very visual learner, it's such a great source of information. I think back to like 2015 or so, and kind of dreaming of starting a farm and thinking about what I want to do, watching people like Greg Judy and seeing what he's doing on his YouTube channel was maybe some of the most influential stuff for me. And so like that's why when I think back on kind of the information, it's a mix of those things. I think the one caution I'd throw out there to folks though is recognizing that that's a good inspiration and that's a good base of knowledge, but until you start doing it, it's different. And like you can read every book you could ever imagine, you can listen to every ranching podcast. Like I'm hoping there's somebody commuting to their office job right now listening to this very podcast, dreaming of starting a farm, and they hear me say that yes, you can use this as information, but take everything you hear with a grain of salt. What's going to work for your context and work for you is going to be different. And until you actually get out there and try some stuff and have some of it work and have some of it fail, that is going to be the real way that you learn. And if I was going to actually point to who's my biggest mentor, it's absolutely been failure. Failure is like the most powerful mentor you could have, because you get to see things and observe things and get to know something in your bones that you'd never be able to do until you've actually failed. And so it's a collage of all of those things working together.
So let's talk about failing at scale and the scale of failure.
I've never failed at scale. I mean, that's the thing.
Well, you have failed at scale. We've all failed at scale. And sometimes the failure is we didn't scale everything up enough, fast enough. And okay. Sometimes I think it's important to be able to find a scale that you can fail at and be willing to fail.
Okay, I see what you're saying now. So yes, all right, then I've failed at scale plenty of times. I guess my point is this: what I have emphasized has been always to fail small.
Yes.
And where
if I fail, it's 40 ducks. Okay, it's 40 ducks. It's $2,000. Big deal. I'll get past it. When I started with the cattle, right, I added 6 animals last October. I'm going to add a few more where I'm basically going to be doubled over the course of this winter. And I'm going to continue to keep trying to expand and double over the next couple of years. And that's because I feel confident now to have 12 animals when I was barely confident to have 3 12 months ago. And it's being willing to do some things, struggle at a small scale so that you can get bigger, so that you can scale. That's typically how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. I'm thinking about it like in the sense of somebody, that's got a multi-thousand-acre commodity farm. I had a friend, he told me this a couple months ago. He had a big drill skip in the middle of one of his corn pivots. It was like, 20 feet wide or whatever, however many 16 rows is. And he thought, well, I'll just go throw a couple pumpkin seeds out there. So he threw, maybe it was watermelon, like 2 seeds out there. And this whole area by the end of the season was completely covered from 2 seeds. So he said, I'm just going to go ahead. We're going to take that to the next level next year. I'm going to make an intentional drill skip in the middle of one of my pivots right off the pivot road. And I'm going to plant my vegetable garden in there. Like, well, that makes sense. I also want to say, I don't know how many days of water this guy has, but he was telling me that he was putting like 1.5 inches of water on the whole pivot every 3 days. So yeah, I mean, if you're getting 3 inches of water twice a week,
anything's going to grow that.
You're going to grow anything.
Well, but honestly, though, those mistakes or those little offshoots, I found, fertilized eggs is an example of that for me. Another biggie is tree seedlings. So every year I sprout thousands of tree seedlings. It started as a way for me to replace the seedlings that died in my orchard and, just basically backfill it. Okay. Oh, I need a new chestnut tree. Well, rather than pay, $7 or $10 a seedling, let me just, sprout it myself. They're pretty easy to sprout once you learn how to do it. Now I'll probably sprout 2,000 chestnut trees this year. And basically
from chestnuts.
From chestnuts. So I have a system where I take chestnuts, I bury them in a bucket with wet sand, bury them underground, sprout all of them, and then I pull them up in the spring and put them in beds, and then let them grow up as bare root tree seedlings. And then I sell those tree seedlings. They're going to be selling for between $7 and $10 per seedling this in like November, late October, November. And so that's a business that I never planned on being in, but over the span of, I don't know, 30 hours of work each year, I'm able to add thousands of dollars to the farm's bottom line, and is relatively low risk. That was never something that I planned on doing or thought I'd be doing, but I just happened to have a bunch of extra. And so I sold them to somebody who wanted to, add chestnuts to his, pasture so he could attract more deer for hunting season. And it's like, okay, that's a market. Okay, let me see how I build on that market. And it gets back to kind of almost where we started this conversation of, if you see and identify a market and can fill that niche, your production part, it becomes the easiest hurdle to overcome. It's much more, will there be people who will pay you enough money to make this profitable to do? That's the important question to ask yourself. That's the thing that you want to be looking for, those markets, and building in on those opportunities.
And just a quick and dirty analogy, you may need to take 100 cows to the sale barn every year in order to be profitable in the cow calf business from a quote conventional mindset, right? But if you're going direct to consumer, maybe you can get that same sort of income on a quarter of the land base, moving 10 animals a year.
Yes. I mean, look, I'll go back to this tree example that I'm just using right now. So in terms of land usage, it's about a quarter of an acre, maybe a little bit more, maybe almost a half. So not a lot of land. It's, from a time perspective, when I'm logging my hours, it's going to end up being 30 to 35 hours by the time I have all the trees boxed up and shipped. And in terms of input costs, I'm going to say it's about $1,500 in input costs for the year. And I will expect to have about $6,000 in net profit from all this activity, unless something catastrophic happens in the next 60 days.
That's
That
not
seems
bad
like a
for
win.
35 hours of work.
That's my point. It's like, and what I'm finding is, and it requires a little bit of hustle, but if I can stack enough activities of my farm in a manner like that, that's how it becomes a viable farm to run. And I'm not losing money. I'm reliably creating profit. I'm expanding year over year. I'm sold out of trees again this year. My biggest mistake is I should have planted probably another 50% than what I did. That to me makes sense. And so it's how do you keep doing those sorts of things? That's the opportunity I see.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about your trees.
Yep.
So you said, let's see, you said chestnuts, you said walnuts, you said apple.
Primarily chestnut, mulberry, black locust, and apple. Those are the 4 big main ones that I do. I've got other things like walnut and butternut that I dabble with, but it's those 4.
Okay, so those aren't necessarily crop trees or things that people are going to be eating. I mean, yeah, apples, of course, walnuts, yeah, but walnut harvesting is not really a hand type operation anymore, from what I understand, and I don't really know of anybody that eats chestnuts anymore. So, it sounds like you're growing a lot of chestnut trees for people to plant for deer habitat, which totally get.
No. So chestnuts are primarily, I see them actually as an eating thing. Look, we could go into a whole jaunt on the history of the American chestnut tree and the tragedy that happened in the early part of the 20th century that basically wiped out what was one of the predominant tree crops of the eastern United States, and like it went away in about 50 years. But the reality is, I think that they are coming back. I raise Chinese American hybrid chestnuts, which are for the most part what I found to be blight resistant. And they can be provided as food for people. They can be provided as food for potentially livestock, and also food for wildlife. And what I've been trying to do is, grow them, 1, because I think they're just good for the land, 2, for the wildlife, and see if I can ultimately, and I haven't had a lot of production yet, but I'm only at year 5, so I'm not expecting much for actually another 2 years. If I can get production out of those trees, that could be either something I sell as a mail order thing. I could be selling it for seed, given how my, kind of tree nursery business is kind of taken off as a little side hustle. So there's ways that you could do there. I could run pigs through part of my pasture and have them essentially have it be like a tool for finishing pork. And so it just gives me a lot of flexibility. It's similar, like why I'm into mulberry. Like mulberry is another one that people are like, wait, what? Where yes, you can eat mulberry. Yes, you can harvest mulberry. You can do a lot of things with it. You can make wine with mulberry. But it's also great for the birds. And so just having that there. Also, it could be potentially great for the geese. I mean, one of the things I'm going to try to experiment with is, can I actually fatten geese on chestnuts and mulberries? And so am I able to actually even get into the realm of ethical foie gras if I could go that route? I don't know these things yet, but trees take a long time to grow. And so your biggest casualty when it comes to trees is time. And so I was much more about, let's get these things in the ground and get them going and see what they produce and see what I can do with them, versus hemming and hawing and hoping I ultimately have the perfect use case for these trees. I mean, the fact that I grow white mulberry, right? One of the things I think about is, do I actually harvest essentially like a fodder system for my cattle, where I'm actually feeding them stockpiled mulberry branches in the winter months as well, as a way to augment, because mulberries, I think it's white mulberry, I think, has like protein levels similar to like alfalfa. And so, like, is that a way to augment my hay and augment my cattle while just simply basically pruning my orchard too? So it's that sort of stuff. And so it's one of those things where the true use, like the business use, is the least developed. It was also the first thing I ever did. And I see just a lot of potential for ways that I can go with it in the future.
And it also has the longest payoff of probably anything.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a guy who made a video on the internet, and so it's a video on the internet, so take what stock you will with it, but he did a pretty good job of making the business case that the lifetime value of a chestnut tree is about $50,000. Which, so you get a couple hundred of those going, and hey, look, I got my retirement plan right there out in the pasture.
Yeah. We have we don't have white mulberries here. We have black mulberries. And the road the county road I actually live on is called Mulberry Creek Road. And there's a mulberry tree about 120 yards west of my back porch that's been there for longer than I can remember, because I grew up in this house that I'm living in now. And that mulberry tree has always been there. Last time we went out to try to get some mulberries off of it, uh, it was July of 21. We went out with a big tarp, and a shaker stick to try to, shake them off the branches. Cause the way they mature here, the whole tree doesn't just suddenly turn at one time. I mean, you'll have half of them green, half of them turn, and the other half are already laying on the ground. And, the deer love them. Like, there's a deer highway going to that tree, and man, they like when those mulberries are dropping, they'll go out there and they'll clean that thing up every day. There's a browse line about 8 feet tall on the tree where there isn't a branch, because that's how high the deer can get when they stand on their back legs. But when we went out there with the tarp, because we were going to try to harvest some mulberries, we went out there, laid the tarp down on the ground, got the pole, and before we started shaking the branch, we looked up, and the whole dang tree was full of hornets and wasps.
Oh.
So we gently folded the tarp back up and walked back to the house. Yeah, this is we're not doing this today, not without bee suits.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously you always have those risks too. But yeah, so I mean, the orchard I have, it's one of those things where like I overplanted it, for example, too, right? So, a lot of these trees have like recommended spacings of like 20 or 30 feet. I planted stuff every 10 feet. And it's again because I'd rather expend a couple extra bucks on a bare root seedling and let it grow for 5 years and then decide, oh, I don't want this one, and then just cut it down, versus have something, a hole, and something dies, because they do die, and suddenly like say, gosh, I wish I had 5 years back to start another tree. Like, you never get that time back. And so overplanting, maybe not having the greatest plan, I think are all mistakes you can make that are going to be to your benefit when you're working with trees.
I've seen it said several places, the best time to plant a tree was yesterday.
And then the second best time is today. So there you go. For everybody listening to this.
Yeah. We've been going for a while. About ready to get out of here. Where can we find you on social media?
Sure. If you're looking for us, it's Goldshaw Farm, GOLDSHAW. You can find us on TikTok, Instagram. We do about 3 YouTube videos a week, and then on Facebook too. So try to make content that just basically tells stories about the stuff that happened on our farm, lessons learned, things from my life, talking about the animals, the stories related to the animals. Just try to bring all those things to life with our various social media accounts.
Very cool. Very cool. So a couple other things I wanted to talk to you about. Solar farm. Let's talk about solar farm maybe going in and what your plan is for that.
Well, so, and I put out a video, I think it was last summer, talking about some plans around potentially trying to put solar infrastructure in where I graze some of my cattle.
Right.
As a way to, again, try to get multiple uses out of a single piece of land. What I've found is I tried to price it out, and I actually, by putting that video out, a lot of like experts came to me and gave me some great information. The cost for creating solar infrastructure that will not get damaged by the cattle is so high that it immediately blows up the business case for actually trying to do that solar field. And so I'm kind of giving up on that. What I have done, though, in the past year is me and some of my neighbors, we actually formed a solar co-op. So essentially creating some areas where there are solar panels and they're kind of well spread out, where potentially we could be grazing some sheep in there. And so that might be something that happens in the future. The sheep are just a lot less
they don't rub
kind of
on
destructive. Shit. Yeah, I mean, they'll rub, but it's not going to do nearly the damage as a 1,000-pound Highland steer bull like will do, and that's the difference. And so
a 200-pound ram is not going to tear up near what 1,000-pound horned Corriente or Highlander will.
Yeah, no. So which is why as I continue to explore, do I ever potentially get into sheep? That's like another argument for it. Because again, I do believe in this premise of, look, fossil fuel availability is going to change whether we like it or not. And so finding alternatives to that is going to be important. And folks who can offer solutions to the kind of broader communities that they're in around that, I think are going to benefit. And so that's why I pretty regularly kind of try to explore ideas like this. It's not to say that our electric infrastructure or solar is like the perfect solution, because I think it's actually far from it. It just, I also just believe that, the way that we have used fossil fuels for the last 60, 75 years, it's just not going to be that way. And so we need an alternative.
Yeah, fossil fuel use has been completely irresponsible. I mean, there's some things we should that we're going to have to continue to use it for, but there's some other uses that we're going to have to curtail and quickly if we want to be able to use these fuels in farther into the future. For the things that they make sense for. I get the whole electric car argument. Okay, we all need to drive electric cars. Fine. Where's the electric excavator, the electric haul truck that's going to mine that shit? Like,
I mean, no, I think you're right. Here's the thing though, and we've added some electric infrastructure to the farm in the last year, where it's like our mower is now electric, and we have a car that's now electric. I still look out, say 5-10 years from now, is there going to be a mid-sized tractor that could be electric? I think that that's going to be reasonable. I think you're right though. The super heavy duty stuff, it's still going to be a decade, 2-3 decades out before that could ever potentially work. But to kind of keep fossil fuel availability for something like that makes a lot more sense than me driving to the post office after this call. Like like there's some things that work for that versus not. And so how do you have a situation where you have the supply of electricity that is not going to be destructive in its own creation, right? That is the thing I think we need to be thinking about. Because to fire turbines, or fire some sort of generator system using fossil fuels just seems silly to me, versus when you really need it in some sort of mobile and power-based form, let's save it for that.
Yeah. Because there's just nothing as energy dense as fossil fuels. I think even the best batteries are still 10 times less energy dense than a gallon of gasoline. I think maybe it might even approach 100 times less dense.
Yeah, and gosh, I feel like I saw a video of a guy talking about like kind of this debate, and how when you start to look at the efficiency of a combustion engine, that energy contained in that gasoline, even that kind of falls out the window quick when you think about internal combustion engines and how efficient they are.
Yeah, how much thermal energy we're going to lose, how much noise energy we're going to lose. Oh yeah, they're not efficient at all. And at the same time we're trying to use less fossil fuel. We need to use the fossil fuels we use need to be used more intelligently and far more efficiently. It's going to be interesting as we move forward in the future, what's going to happen economically with cost of transportation, cost of inputs, and just the cost to get our products to market in front of our consumers.
So I was actually just down last week in New York. YouTube of all people brought me down to New York to, like, they were kind of hosting a climate summit, and I went to a couple of other things because it was like all UN week going on down there last week. And when you start to have conversations with folks who are completely removed from agriculture, right, and how they're seeing kind of what the solution set needs to look like, as well as the needs of the future, I think it's very different than what somebody like you or me or somebody even listening to this podcast would believe. And yet at the same time, these policy decisions and discussions are going on right now. And so there is a need for folks in agriculture to kind of talk about, how do we think about addressing climate crisis? Because I fundamentally believe that is something that exists as well, but recognize that there are going to be some myths and some solutions. I don't believe it's eating, acres and acres of soybeans as a way to like make it happen, but shifting the perception of the cow, right? I had 24 conversations with folks last week talking about how I believe that cattle can be part of the solution for fighting climate change, versus being kind of the monster that I think they're often depicted as. And that's a discussion that's happening right now.
Yeah. And, there's also, I think the discussion is starting between the kind of agriculture that you and I are practicing, and hopefully most of the people listening to this podcast are practicing, versus the conventional production model, which would be, basically feedlots, huge confinement feeding operations. And we can even talk about that in hogs and in chickens, because it's the conditions inside a hog barn or a chicken barn are just absolutely horrific. I mean, let's be honest. Conditions at a feedlot for cattle, they're not much better. And we got sold this lie that, we have to have this scale. We have to have this efficiency because, one guy's responsible for, 25, I've got to ride through 25,000 head of cattle. I don't have 30 minutes to go pull a sick one out of a pen. So that's why everything gets antibiotics off the truck. Like, wait a minute.
Which gets back to the historical assumptions and assuming I need to be at this scale to make this work, versus if you focus on kind of starting small and building from a profitability mindset, it's just a different way to look at it. I think, the other thing too, like, and you bring up cattle and you bring up pigs and chickens, right? Whenever I have a debate with somebody who's a vegan, right, and is saying, oh gosh, eating meat is the worst thing you can do for the climate, I have a very hard time defending eating chicken and pork. Like I can easily make the argument for rabbit and cattle and sheep and goat and geese. I can have that argument, and I feel like I can make a great case for it. When it comes to cattle, when it comes to pigs and chickens, that's harder to do. The amount of inputs, the amount that it's required to actually get them going, ecologically, it isn't great. And so I think the more that we in ag can have these conversations honestly and just say, yeah, maybe this isn't the best thing, and maybe there is a different model, and maybe you need to think about how this can come together. I think that that's going to be something that's needed.
So we're on this trail. Scalability. That's one of the things that critics of regenerative agriculture and supporters of the current system like to point out, is they don't think that regenerative agriculture can feed the world. And I would push back on that real hard. Like, I don't give a crap about feeding the world anymore. I want to feed my family first, and then I want to feed my community second, and I'll feed my country third. And if there's anything left over, then maybe we can think about feeding the world. The feeding the world mentality got us where we are. And what are we feeding the world? We're feeding the world dent corn and soybeans. Bullshit. Oh, well, those are cow feed. Those are cow feed that have a lot of gallons of diesel involved and a lot of rubberized miles involved to get them there. From where we're at to get regenerative ag to scale to where we could feed ourselves requires a lot more manpower than is currently available, and probably a lot more manpower than people are willing to put in. Let's face it, growing food is fucking hard. It's hard. It's brutal work in all weather conditions every day. There's the highest emotional highs and the lowest emotional lows, and sometimes those happen within minutes of each other. And not everybody can do it. Not everybody can tolerate having their fortunes dictated mostly by the weather. That's why people go to town and get jobs.
Yeah, no, look, the scalability thing is a very real issue for regenerative ag. I think there's two things though that I think always get discounted and ignored in those discussions. In that, number one, and you're right, it's not for everybody, but how do you inspire more small scale producers and more folks thinking about how to manage their land in a regenerative fashion, how to manage their land where they're stacking multiple micro enterprises on a single piece of land? Like, how do you inspire more of that is one piece. I think the second piece is we keep looking at the world in the context and situation that we're in today of, well, the way all the farms are set up right now wouldn't work for, say, kind of intensive grazing programs. But look, like,
30 years ago, we were using, the telephone to connect phones for the internet. And now we've like completely gone away from it. I shouldn't say completely. We've significantly gone away from that. And so the idea that things will remain in constant the way they are today, and they can only be managed in the way they are today with the sale barn model and with the way land is set up and the way fencing infrastructure is set up today, and how farmers sell their product, like, because it's the way it is right now, it can never change, is a complete fallacy. And so if you start to rethink certain things, whether it's how we think about land usage, how we think about water usage, how we think about potentially mobile infrastructure, right? Like the revolution that the polywire and the reel were for regenerative ag is maybe one step. What if we have robots that become the fence for cattle that are moving on a larger range? And like you have 4 robots that move together in unison, constantly moving a fence. I make all this stuff up, but my point still remains. We're not thinking about where things are going. We are just thinking about where things are when we make that argument of, oh, it's not scalable.
And you're right. We can't just focus on what we have now. We have to look down the road to the future, and we have to build a better agricultural future, not for us, not just for our children, but for our children's children and the next 5 generations that are coming after them. We got to think about what we're leaving behind. And I have a really hard time, like when a farmer that's farming, a broadacre farmer, 5,000 acres, gets up in the morning, kisses his 2-year-old and his 5-year-old goodbye, goes out, jumps in the sprayer, and drives around all day spraying glyphosate or God knows whatever. Meanwhile, his wife took half the day off her town job because both of their kids are sick, and she's running around to doctor's appointments. Like this madness, where the madness is we've been told how to eat by the people that are selling us the food, that not only sell us the food, they sell the chemicals that go on the food, they sell the food, and then they get to sell us the drugs to fix the problems in our human health that the fucked up food causes.
Right. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza. Yeah,
yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah.
And then there's guys like you and me that are really trying to change the system, and we get so much pushback. It's like, guys, I really wish you'd realize what you're doing to the world here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but let me, I'm going to play devil's advocate on you there, Brian, because here's the other thing that I feel like I want to continue to learn. And if anybody hears this podcast and is in this situation, please shoot me an email, goldshawfarm@gmail.com, because I don't feel like I've taken enough time to walk a mile in, say, a conventional rancher's shoes. I know I haven't. I will fully recognize that. I've spent a lot of time actually with conventional dairy folks around here, just because that's what I've got in my area. But, seeing large beef operations that are done in the conventional model, I haven't spent nearly as much time, because I don't think you can promote change until you truly have walked that couple of miles in somebody else's shoes either. And so I do want to recognize that that is a weakness as well. But I think your point of, hey, look, things are not getting better as we keep doing the same thing over and over again. That's I feel like everybody can acknowledge that. What's the solution? I wouldn't be so bold as to say I feel like I truly have it, but I think that there are better ways, or at least ways that seem like they're better. And so how do we keep looking and seeing what the pitfalls are for somebody who's coming from that different context? I think that's an important thing that still needs to happen.
It just seems like every time, the big ag companies tell us we need to double down on something, BT corn, Roundup Ready soybeans, what's the new one? Dicamba, the Dicamba Ready crops. Like every time we double down and use like the next biggest thing that makes the chemical companies billions of dollars, it ends up being a bad deal. And there's a point where I think that there's a breaking point where the producers are going to go, they're just going to throw up their hands and go, no, like this is not working. This path is not working. You're running us into a brick wall. We got to do something different. Yeah. So, I don't know. Probably a good place to end.
Someday, some way, somehow, man.
we'll figure out this food system thing one way or another and keep the world from starving to death, I hope.
I sure hope so.
All right. You got anything you want to end with?
No, I think that's a great spot.
All right. Well, that's it then. Have a great week.
Awesome, man. Thank you for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was. It's great meeting you, and you have a great week, and everybody
Absolutely.
out there.
Hey, when's this coming? Let me know when this is coming out, because I'll definitely want to promote it. I think it's a great conversation and such.
Gosh, I suck at life. Probably some 10:10 or 10:17.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just like shoot me a note once you're getting ready to post live, and yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to be pretty good about that. When I get everything loaded up and I start editing, I try to let the guests know, hey, you're next in line for editing. You're coming up Monday. But I can't send you links.
That's cool. I totally yeah. Plus, you never want to share a link on a podcast because everybody gets their podcast somewhere else, and yeah, it's always weird.
Well, I'm still trying to figure out how to share links correctly and promote. I'll figure one of these days I might actually figure it out and get more than about 20 people listening to this thing.
Well, I'll try to help you there. But hey, man, I really appreciate meeting you. Great chat.
Yep, great chat. Enjoy the rest of your day, bud.
All right, thanks, Brian. Bye.